They said King Robert Baratheon was too stubborn to die. Whispers in the halls of the Red Keep suggested that even the stranger himself could not budge him from the mortal world, not while he still had words to roar and wine to drink. And so, against every fearful expectation, the king survived the boar's savage gouge during that fateful hunt. Wounded, yes, but saved by Grand Maester Pycelle's feverish ministrations and by Eddard Stark's unwavering presence at his bedside. It was whispered by some that Ned Stark's grim perseverance kept Robert's soul tethered to the living. Others attributed it to blind luck or the will of the gods. The truth was simpler than all that. If one truly knew the man, Robert Baratheon would not allow himself to die with unfinished business. He awoke in a bed soaked with sweat, the stench of old blood in the air, pain burning a raging path through his midsection. When at last he could speak, his words were wrought with anger, confusion, and fleeting guilt. And in those first few days of watery broths and forced convalescence, a painful hush hovered over the Red Keep, a hush that grew more charged with each letter that arrived from across the realm. Men who had seen the king's mortal wound assumed the worst, and lords in every corner of Westeros waited with bated breath to learn if the old rebellion's hero would draw breath at dawn or pass into the shadows of legend. But King Robert refused death, cursing the gods and his own carelessness with each breath that filled his large chest, until the color began to return to his cheeks and the spark to his eyes. His mood turned thoughtful in a way none had ever witnessed. Since he was bedridden, his cups were restricted, the only wine he drank was diluted and often replaced with water by the cunning maesters. He chafed at his own helplessness, snapping at servants, but there was a transformation in him too, a restlessness born of near-death. He would gaze at his scar, run his massive calloused hands over the bandages, and mutter to himself about how close he had come to leaving this world with so much undone. Ned Stark, who seldom left the king's side, recognized a terrible burden pressing upon Robert's heart. They had been friends long enough that Ned needed no flowery words to sense the shift. In hushed conversations, Robert admitted to a swirling confusion that gnawed at him, a need for truth rather than the half-truths he had told himself since the end of the rebellion. The near brush with death had stirred Robert's old ghost, Lyanna Stark, the woman he had loved and lost, the shadow that had hovered over the realm's fate. It began with Robert asking Ned on a quiet morning just as dawn's pale light seeped into the royal bedchamber, if I had died back there with that thrice-damned boar, what would have become of the realm? Ned's eyes, solemn as winter, had flicked with discomfort. Robert's tone was free of anger but taut with something like fear. They would have crowned Joffrey, Ned answered, and Cersei would have become regent until he came of age. For a moment, Robert seemed to suck in his rage, his mouth twisting. Yes, he said. That is what I decreed. But do you trust him, Ned? My boy. Ned was silent, painfully so. In that silence, Robert read his old friend's wariness. Tell me, at least, that he's truly mine, Robert demanded quietly. Even before Ned answered, Robert gave a bitter laugh. He had heard the rumors. He had drunk them down with every cup of wine, always brushing them aside. Now that he had nearly died, the rancid taste of those rumors was something he could no longer swallow. Ned could see it as plainly as the bandages on Robert's chest. The king demanded answers with a terrible fire. Ned, who had come to King's Landing with the best intentions but had always been shackled by a misguided sense of duty and honor, found himself unraveling under Robert's questions. And so, on the day the king was finally able to sit upright without losing breath, Ned spilled the truth Robert had never wanted to truly face. None of Cersei's children bore his blood. They were the products of a secret union, Lannister seeds in the Baratheon bed. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, they were not his. They were Jaime's get. Rage was too small a word for what consumed Robert. He tried to rise from bed, tried to shout for the King's Guard, for Cersei's head, for Jaime's, for all the Lannisters. Ned stopped him, pushing him back against the pillows, reminding him that he could barely stand yet. But in that day and night of fury, a new direction began. Robert would not turn a blind eye. He could not. He had nearly died, and with the realization that he would have left the realm to bastards and treason, he felt a shame and an anger that shook him to the core. He insisted on silence for the moment, conferring only with Ned and Barristan Selmy, the one Kingsguard he still trusted implicitly. Barristan, ancient warrior of the realm, had suspected something was amiss when he discovered the queen's overly cunning manipulations, but duty had sealed his lips. Now, the king's slow, rumbling wrath demanded he set aside illusions. For days Robert laid out a plan from his bed. He needed a legitimate heir, one of his own blood or, if the gods willed it, a child of House Baratheon's rightful line. He recalled Stannis on Dragonstone, Renly in the capital, but neither brother had quite been the child of destiny for him. Even his talk of heirs turned back to Lyanna Stark, and Ned saw the old heartbreak flaring in his friend's eyes. Lyanna, stolen from him by Rhaegar Targaryen's lust, a lust that had ignited the rebellion and cost the realm thousands of lives. It was then Ned had to break another vow, forging the final link in the chain of revelations that would change Westeros. He told Robert what he had guarded for years: Jon Snow was not his child, but Lyanna's. Not only that, but fathered by Rhaegar Targaryen in a union that Ned believed had been more than mere abduction. "She made me promise," Ned said, voice quavering with the memory, "to protect her son, her true-born son, Robert, who until that moment had been swallowed by hatred for all Targaryens." Listened through clenched teeth. But a strange calmness came over him when Ned, tears in his eyes, told him how Lyanna had not died a wanton captive, but a woman who had chosen Rhaegar, who had borne him a child, and who had breathed her last in her brother's arms, binding him to her final, desperate request. She had always feared what Robert would do if he found the boy. She had always feared that the old rage, the old thirst for vengeance against House Targaryen, would trump any love Robert once had for her. Ned expected Robert to roar, to call him a liar. But the near-death experience had cracked the king's old armor of fury, and the helpless hours in bed had stirred a longing in him, for truth, for reconciliation, maybe even for absolution. He demanded to see the boy, to see Ned's bastard nephew who was not a bastard at all. "I want to look upon the last Targaryen whelp, if that's what he is," Robert said. "And if I see the dragon in his eyes, I'll know. But if he has Lyanna's eyes, God's help me, Ned, I won't kill a child of hers. Not after this. Not after I nearly died without seeing. Without making it right." That was Robert's vow. If Jon Snow truly was Lyanna's, he would not see the sword from Robert's hand. Eddard Stark pleaded with him that the boy was indeed Lyanna's and not an abomination. He was loyal, honorable, and decent, traits that might have come from neither Targaryen nor Baratheon blood, but from the Stark side that had raised him. Above all, Ned was convinced that Jon Snow was a good lad. When Robert finally recovered enough to begin taking short walks, he ordered that the boy be brought from the wall. The letters flew north, demanding that Jon Snow, presently a new recruit of the Night's Watch, was to come to King's Landing on the king's command for pressing business. It was an astonishing command, one that set ravens ablaze with rumor. Jon Snow, barely in black for a few moons, found himself singled out by an edict from the king himself. He was young and uncertain, his heart heavy with the vow he had made to the Watch. But Maester Aemon counseled him that one must heed the king's call, that duty to the realm might supersede even the vow. And so Jon set out, guided by an honor guard from the crown, heading south with more questions than answers. In the intervening weeks, Robert confronted Cersei. It was not the confrontation of an enraged bull, but that of a wounded lion cornered. He told her he knew the truth of the children, that he had no intention of naming any of them his heir, and that if she so much as lifted a finger against Ned Stark or any loyal retainer, he would ensure House Lannister paid in blood. Terrified, Cersei at first tried to spin more lies, but Robert's glare and the presence of Ser Barristan and reminded her that this was no bluff. Yet Robert did not cast her aside or put her to death, not yet. He had to be certain of his next steps, and any move that dethroned the Lannisters would risk plunging the Seven Kingdoms into chaos. He simply told Cersei that her place at court was no longer secure and that the realm would learn the truth in Robert's time, not hers. The tension in the Red Keep coalesced like a gathering storm. The Lannisters withdrew from the king's presence, forging alliances quietly while Robert continued to recover and steel himself for a transformation of the realm. The small council was paralyzed, uncertain whether they still served the king or if they were pawns in a growing civil war. Lord Varys vanished into the labyrinth of his whisperers, gathering secrets. Littlefinger practiced caution, hearing rumor of a Targaryen heir still alive, some said across the sea, some said in the north. And in the midst of all that, Ned Stark stood unyielding at Robert's side, seeing that same old friend he had known in the rebellion, furious, flawed, but capable of surprising acts of grace. The day Jon Snow arrived in King's Landing, the city was awash in dread rumors. Had the king called the Black Brother to strip him of his vows? Had he found proof of a Targaryen lineage? Jon, dusty from weeks of travel, walked into the Red Keep with something like wonder and more than a little fear etched into his dark gray eyes. He had dreamt of the day he might see the Southlands, the seat of the king's power. But not like this. Not summoned like a criminal or some curiosity. The moment Robert gazed upon Jon, the king felt a blow to his heart. It was as though Lyanna stood before him, resurrected in the eyes of a dark-haired boy. For while Jon had the black hair of the Starks, the shape of his face, something in the tilt of his head, was reminiscent of Lyanna's grace. Gods, Robert muttered, stepping back from the throne. He looked so much like her. And though the king had expected to see the silver hair of the Targaryens or some sign of Rhaegar's blood, it was the ghost of Lyanna that struck him hardest. Jon knelt. "Your Grace," he said. "Get up, boy," Robert said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. You're unexpected." They spoke in private, with Ned present, the boy trembling under the weight of revelations. In a few short breaths, Robert revealed that Jon was no Snow at all, not even Ned's. He was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, conceived in love, or so Ned insisted. Jon felt the ground shift beneath his feet, everything he had believed about his identity cast aside. He was no bastard of Winterfell, but the last known child of the very prince Robert had loathed. That conflict raged in Robert's eyes. Yet the king did not raise a sword to kill him. Instead, he quietly asked, "Do you remember anything of your mother? Or of—" Robert bit off the last word, unwilling to say Rhaegar's name. Jon shook his head, confused. He had only known the cold comfort of Winterfell's tolerance, the watchful eyes of Ned Stark, and the distance of Catelyn. He had no memories of any mother or father beyond the glimpses of kindness Ned offered him. And that, perhaps, kept Robert's rage at bay, for how could he hate a boy who had never known his parents? Thus began the strangest dance in the Red Keep's history. Robert Baratheon, still king of the Seven Kingdoms, had at his command a living Targaryen. News of Daenerys Targaryen's doings across the sea had trickled in, but now there was a Targaryen on the mainland, one with Stark blood as well. Varys, Littlefinger, and others crowded near the throne, waiting for a sign of how Robert would handle this revelation. But Robert told only a select few. He wanted to do this properly, with caution. He intended to proclaim Jon as Lyanna's heir, a living link between the North and the Crown, to quell any further talk of a Lannister hold on the throne. Why? Because something had changed in Robert's heart. He refused to leave the realm in the hands of bastards or in the midst of another war. He had nearly died from a boar's tusk, and in that near death he saw all the devastation that might come. He saw what his own rage had wrought in the past, from the sacking of kings landing to the hunts for Targaryen exiles. He had spilled so much blood, all the while ignoring the deeper guilt in his chest, that Lyanna had never loved him as he loved her. And yet her final bequest was a living son, a final chance for Robert to atone. But that was not easy. The realm would hardly accept a Targaryen heir, and Jon himself was torn, a vow-broken brother of the Night's Watch, forced into a place where the laws of gods and men forbid him to hold lands or titles. The solution, in typical Baratheon style, came with pragmatism. If a king can absolve men of crimes, a king can release men from vows, Robert said. You swore your life to the Night's Watch, boy, but we have need of you here. If the watch still stands at the wall and your brothers do not cry out, I say you're free. Word was sent to Lord Commander Mormont, who, though reluctant, yielded to the king's command. The realm was in precarious shape, and if the king demanded the boy, the watch could not stand against the crown. So Jon Snow, or Targaryen or Stark, he knew not what to call himself, was effectively unbound, brought in secret council. Grand Maester Pycelle, quickly coaxed into agreement by Robert's new determination, began forging papers that acknowledged Jon as the rightful son of Lyanna Stark. They left mention of Rhaegar's paternity oblique, hinting at a secret wedding or a legitimate union, so that no one could call him a bastard. The Lannisters fumed. Tywin Lannister, hearing from Cersei that the king intended to name this boy as a potential heir, recognized a mortal blow to the Lannister ambitions. Tywin had pinned his hopes on the golden-haired children being Baratheon enough to take the throne one day. Now that was threatened by a ghost from the rebellion, a boy with Stark eyes and Targaryen blood. Incensed, Tywin began secret preparations, forging alliances, calling in debts. If Robert publicly cast out Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, House Lannister's power would be wounded. But Tywin was not a man to accept defeat. In a swirl of clandestine meetings, the realm braced for an upheaval. But Robert, with Ned Stark's steadfast hand, strove to keep the peace. If the king publicly cried treason against Cersei and Jaime, war with the West would erupt. Instead, he planned a more delicate unraveling. He confided in wise counselors, including Barristan and Selmy and Varys, who had their own reasons for wanting stability. Together, they formed a plan to legitimize Jon not as a Targaryen but as a recognized nephew of the king, son of Lyanna Stark, father unnamed but rumored to be a powerful ally from the time of the rebellion. There would be rumors of a quiet betrothal for Lyanna if Robert died in the war. The public might never learn the full truth, at least not now, but they would see that the king wanted this boy recognized. Jon struggled mightily with this revelation. He had worn black and was proud to have found a purpose on the wall. Now that identity was stripped away, replaced with one far more perilous. Some nights he stayed awake, haunted by the face of his friend Samwell Tarly left behind at the wall, or by the vow he had made and broken at the king's command. He questioned if this was truly his place. He questioned if, in his heart, he was more a Stark or a Targaryen or neither. He even questioned if he wanted any part of a life in King's Landing, where men's words cut sharper than Valyrian steel. But one day, after a heated meeting in the small council chamber, Robert pulled Jon aside. The king's voice was rough, but there was an earnestness in his eyes rarely seen. "I want you to have what was stolen from me," he said. "I wanted your mother's love. She never gave it to me, but that was no fault of yours. She chose Rhaegar, but she died. And well, boy, I ended up with a head full of regrets. You, though, you're a chance for me to do one damn thing right in this life. To stand before the gods and say I did not punish a child for his father's sins. And more than that, I see a kindness in you. A sense of honor. I had that once before the throne ground me down." He clapped Jon's shoulder, eyes gleaming with unshed tears that turned swiftly to a crooked smile. "Don't let it grind you down too." In that fragile moment, Jon felt a stir of compassion for the man whose entire world had been shaped by a single heartbreak, a single lost love. For if Robert had died that day on the hunting field, he would have gone to his grave never knowing Lyanna's child still lived. And now, faced with that knowledge, Robert wanted to set it right. Cersei hated Jon with a smoldering intensity, seeing in him a threat to the security of her children. She unleashed her scorn in the shadows, calling him a whelp, a bastard, insinuating that the king had grown feeble from his wounds. Jaime, torn by his own guilt and complicated love, tried to advise caution. "The king is a wounded boar," Jaime said to her in confidence. "He might lash out. We need to move carefully or we risk losing everything." Thus, for a time, a tense equilibrium took hold. Robert was recovering and still in full possession of the throne. His small council recognized that the king's wrath was no small threat. And the realm was perplexed by the presence of Lord Stark's nephew, a newcomer in the Red Keep, recognized and named legitimate as Jon, merely Jon, or so many called him. The king did not see fit to grant him a surname publicly, but among confidants, Robert referred to him as the true child of Lyanna Stark. Ned Stark, for his part, was relieved beyond measure that he no longer bore the lonely burden of that secret. He dreaded the day Robert's old hatreds might flare, but he saw a quieter sorrow in his friend's eyes now, an acceptance that could blossom into a kind of grace. "Lyanna might have loved you had things been different," Ned once said softly to Robert. "But we can't change the past. We can only do right in the present." And Robert, perhaps for the first time since the rebellion, listened. But the wheels of politics turned still. Tywin Lannister sent feelers out to the north, to the Reach, to the Stormlands. He demanded fealty from his bannermen, preparing for a day when the king might discard his grandchildren altogether. He even recalled Tyrion from some errand across the realm, summoning the imp to King's Landing so they might unify. But Tyrion, no fool, perceived that the king was deadly serious about forging a new future and that House Lannister must adapt or face ruin. In closed-door sessions, he tried to persuade Tywin that an open conflict would be disastrous. "Cersei has overstepped," Tyrion said, "and if it comes to war, we lose. The king's allies, if rallied, outnumber us. The Vale might remain neutral, but the north is with Stark, the Crownlands are King Robert's, and the Stormlands remain loyal to their stag." Yet Tywin's pride was vast, and so the tension built like a bowstring, waiting to snap. Meanwhile, Jon found himself in the awkward position of living as a royal ward. Though not officially recognized as a Baratheon or a Targaryen, he was afforded some measure of respect due to Ned Stark's presence and the king's open favoritism. He discovered new mentors, Ser Barristan and among them, who taught him swordsmanship and the courtly ways that had never been part of his training in Winterfell. He was polite to Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen, who, in their innocence, saw him as a curious newcomer with the bearing of the North in his manners. Joffrey, though, hated him from the start. He recognized in this boy a threat to everything he believed was his by right. Joffrey hurled barbs and insults, calling Jon a mongrel and a black brother. Jon, who had learned patience on the wall, tried not to rise to the bait. But in one courtyard exchange, Joffrey went too far, boasting that he would see the heads of traitors on spikes, and that if Robert died, Joffrey would be king, and Jon might find himself short ahead. The king, hearing of this, had Joffrey soundly berated in front of the court, a humiliating affair that made the boy's eyes burn with hatred for both Jon and his father. But Robert did not relent. He was resolved that the realm would know who truly held the reins of power. He would not have Joffrey bullying a boy who had his mother's eyes. And so the days turned to weeks, the weeks to months, with conspiracies swirling in the Red Keep. Rumors drifted from across the narrow sea of Daenerys Targaryen, rumored now to have dragons. Such news might once have driven Robert into a fury, calling for her head, but he hesitated. A living Targaryen across the sea, a living Targaryen in his own halls, maybe the gods had a reason for it. Maybe the realm would have to prepare for changes that Robert, in his younger years, would have smashed with a warhammer. But something had softened in him. A near-death could change a man, especially one who realized just how fragile his hold on everything was. Yet the transformation was far from easy. Robert still had a monstrous temper, still drowned his nights in wine, still sought the warmth of whores rather than share a bed with the queen he loathed. But at least now he sought counsel from Ned. He tested Jon's honor by giving him small tasks, leading inspection of the royal stables, sitting in on petty judgments in the throne room. Jon, shy at first, grew more certain. He heard the pleas of peasants who had come for justice and recognized that a king's justice could be as cold or hot as the man on the throne. But he tried to be fair, to mirror Ned's quiet sense of duty. Robert watched with a certain pride. He saw in the boy something Rhaegar had never shown: humility. Thus a new era seemed almost possible. If only the realm would accept it, if only the lords would bend easily. But House Lannister refused to be supplanted. They schemed with some of the Tyrells, inviting them to consider a marriage alliance that could overshadow the new Stark boy favored by the king. Mace Tyrell, ever eager for greater power, dallied with the idea. But Ned Stark, seeing the danger, reminded Robert of the friendships they could call upon. House Arryn had lost Lord Jon Arryn, true, but the young Lord Robert Arryn in the Vale might still recall Ned's fostering. House Tully in the Riverlands remained an uncertain ally, but Edmure Tully might be swayed by a generous marriage arrangement. The Greyjoys were restive on their isles, but none in the north or the Crownlands had any desire to see them rise again. The puzzle of alliances became Robert's new game, overshadowing the hunts he once loved, overshadowing the easy days of jest and wine. If the realm was to accept Jon as some manner of recognized heir, or at least part of a stable line of succession, the king needed to ensure the great houses did not rebel. Which led to the day Robert, in the great hall of the Red Keep, stood before a gathering of lords and knights with Ned Stark at his side and proclaimed that his wife's children, while dear to him, would not be first in line for the throne. "If I should die," Robert said in a booming voice that echoed off the high stone walls, "I name Jon, nephew of my good brother Ned Stark, as my designated heir. Should I die without further issue of my own body, the crown shall pass to him." A ripple of shock coursed through the hall. Even men who had heard rumors of such a plan were stunned to see Robert make it public. Cersei stood pale and stiff, Joffrey furiously silent. Tyrion observed from the side, no doubt calculating all possible angles. Pycelle, swaying on his feet, declared in his reedy voice that the king's word was law. Many men looked from Jon to Ned Stark in confusion, but the king offered no further explanation beyond calling the boy the rightful child of Lyanna Stark, placed under Robert's protection. By the laws of Westeros, a king might name whomever he wished as heir if there was no question of his own legitimate children. Yet the hush that fell was a testament to how unimaginable it was that Robert would skip his own purported children. That act alone called the parentage of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen into question, a deafening subtext. At once, lords began to whisper, alliances began to crumble, and the tension with House Lannister reached a fever pitch. Tywin, in fury, ordered a mass exodus of the Lannister retinue from King's Landing, retreating to Casterly Rock to gather forces. But Robert was ready to meet force with force if need be. He had no illusions that the Lannisters would take this blow lying down. He had men readied in the Crownlands, commanded them to fortify the roads, and made quiet appeals to House Tyrell, House Martell, House Tully, and House Arryn, reminding them that a war would not benefit the realm. "I am not the same man you once knew," Robert wrote to them. "I wish to avoid needless bloodshed, but I will not suffer tyranny from the West. The lords weighed their options. Many of them still recalled the devastation of the last war, of the rebellion and the Greyjoy uprising. They had no appetite to see the realm sundered again. So most resolved to see how matters played out, hoping that cooler heads might prevail. Yet some, particularly those in the west, chafed at the king's edict, believing the Lannisters had been slighted. Cersei, deprived of her illusions, seethed in the Red Keep. She might have tried to murder Jon Snow in silence, but Robert had placed Jon under constant guard by men loyal to the king. The days became a chessboard of suspicion, watchers on every corner, poisoners deterred by the threat of immediate death if caught. Queen Cersei was not so bold as to attempt open murder of the boy in the king's seat, but her resentments festered. She taunted him in passing, once spitting near his feet in private, whispering that he was an unnatural spawn of traitors. Jon, forced to hold his tongue, felt the weight of courtly politics press upon him. In the midst of this, Ned urged his nephew son to be patient. He praised the boy's calm and sense of justice, assured Jon that soon they would be able to return to Winterfell for a time. If you are to be heir to the throne, Ned told him, you must know the realm, its people, its troubles. But the north is your mother's land, and if ever you feel lost, let its cold winds remind you of who you are. Jon asked him if that meant he should renounce the Targaryen name if it ever came to light. Ned said nothing, only looked at him with a sorrow that spoke volumes. One crisp morning, as tension still built in the capital, Robert insisted on hosting a small feast for the visiting lords who lingered, hoping that wine and hearty laughter might calm the realm. In the middle of the feast, Joffrey, who had drunk too deeply of wine, picked a quarrel with Jon. He railed at the injustice of being denied what he believed was his right, spat out that Jon was a bastard, no matter what the king proclaimed. Jon, stung, tried to walk away, but Joffrey would not let him go, demanding a duel of honor. The king slammed his fist on the table and roared for Joffrey to sit down. But Joffrey's face was already red with humiliation, the mocking laughs of onlookers fueling his pride. If he is so honorable, let him prove it, Joffrey sneered, eyes shining with malice. If you are to be king one day, boy, show me how you wield a blade. Jon tried to decline. He did not want to draw steel on the boy who was once believed to be Robert's heir. But the king looked at him thoughtfully, then said in a grim voice, let it be a friendly match with blunted blades. No blood. The courtyard was cleared. Servants brought 2 blunted tourney swords. Joffrey stood in his gilded tunic, pale hair shining, while Jon, dressed in plain dark clothes, lifted his blade uncertainly. The watchers ringed around them, lords, knights, ladies, maesters. Cersei smirked, certain her boy's skill with the sword would humiliate this northern upstart. Robert sat on a bench, Ned at his side, both men tense. The fight began. Joffrey lunged with surprising speed, for he had some skill thanks to masters-at-arms who had trained him. But Jon had lived on the wall where every day was a scramble for survival. He was not a natural swordsman like some knights, but Ser Alliser Thorne's harsh training had honed his reflexes and he had found a measure of skill. He parried Joffrey's wild strikes calmly, letting the prince exhaust himself. Each clang of the steel resounded in the cold courtyard air. Joffrey's face twisted into a mask of fury as Jon quietly deflected blow after blow. Finally, Joffrey overextended, driven by pride. Jon feinted to the side and brought his blunted sword against the back of Joffrey's leg, knocking him to his knees. Joffrey gasped, stunned, sword dropping from his fingers. The courtyard fell silent. Jon, breathing heavily, lowered his blade at once and stepped back. He did not crow, did not taunt. He merely said, I yield. I do not want to hurt him. But the damage was done. Joffrey's humiliation was complete. He glared at Jon with venomous hatred. Robert shook his head as though seeing in Joffrey a reflection of what might have been if he himself had grown up coddled and twisted. Ned Stark had no smile, only a faint sadness. The watchers dispersed, unsettled by the scene. Cersei demanded vengeance for the slight, but Robert would hear none of it, saying Joffrey had demanded the duel and must learn to accept its outcome. In those days, talk spread that the realm was on the brink of war again. Whispers of a Lannister host mustering in the west, caravans of gold sent to secure Selzwards. Robert responded by gathering loyal bannermen and ordering loyal storm lords to King's Landing to show their strength. Ned wrote to Robb in Winterfell, telling his son to prepare the North's armies if House Lannister marched. Meanwhile, envoys from Dorne arrived, curious as to this new arrangement with the so-called Targaryen boy. The memory of Elia Martell's fate still stained relations with House Targaryen and House Baratheon, but Robert strove to reassure them that if the boy was more Stark than Targaryen, perhaps the old hatreds could rest. Dorne remained cautious, refusing open support but not outright hostility. Amid all this, Jon trained daily with the sword, determined not to shame the king who had placed unexpected trust in him. He had found a certain solace in his friendship with Arya Stark, who had accompanied her father to the capital. Arya was enthralled by the skill of the sword, sneaking off to watch from the shadows. Sometimes Jon would let her hold the practiced sword, guiding her arms in basic forms, though he cautioned that her father would not approve. Still, the bright look in her eyes reminded him of what it felt like to be truly free, unburdened by the weight of crowns and secrets. But the gods seldom allow peace to linger long in Westeros. One night, a hush fell over the keep when a letter arrived. Tywin Lannister had officially called his banners, citing grave insult to his house. He demanded that King Robert present himself and confirm or deny the rumors that the children of Cersei Lannister were to be disinherited. If the king refused, Tywin implied he would march on the capital. The moment was a stark choice: give up the claim of Jon as heir or risk war. Robert stood in the small council chamber, fists clenched on the war table. Ned was with him, as was Jon, though the boy felt out of place among lords and generals. "If I yield," Robert said, "then I am not but a puppet, and the realm sees me as too weak to challenge the Lannisters. But if I stand strong, thousands might die." He gazed at Ned, then at Jon. "I have spilled enough blood in my lifetime," he said in a low voice, "but I will not let Tywin Lannister or his golden heirs rule through me. I have done too much as a lazy king. Now, well, sometimes the price of doing right is high." So war loomed. The ravens took flight. The crownlands readied. Houses Baratheon, Tully, Arryn, and Stark aligned in a brittle alliance reminiscent of the rebellion's days, all prepared to resist Lannister aggression. Robert tried to keep calm, though Ned saw the sorrow in his eyes. "Let there be no talk of mercy if they come for the boy," Robert said. "If Tywin tries to take Jon's head, he shall find that I still remember how to swing a warhammer." A few nights later, a hush fell over the Red Keep when riders were spotted in the courtyard. They carried the banner of House Lannister. At their head was Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer himself, come to parley under a flag of truce. Robert received him in the throne room with all the pomp of the king's majesty. The Iron Throne loomed behind Robert like a jagged silhouette, and torches glimmered on the polished armor of the King Guard. Jaime, golden hair shining, removed his helm and bowed low, posture measured. They sparred in words. Jaime declared that Tywin demanded a public clarification of the king's succession. He said that Joffrey was widely recognized as Robert's trueborn son, that rumors of incest were vile lies. Robert's jaw tightened at that, but he let Jaime speak. Jaime then demanded that if the king did not recant his plan to name Jon, the Lannisters would have no choice but to defend their honor. Robert answered with a voice that rumbled like a distant thunder. "Defend your honor?" he repeated, eyes blazing. "Your house has no honor left after what I've discovered. But I will offer you one last chance, Jaime. Call back your father's banners. Let us quietly arrange for Joffrey to abdicate any claim, and I will not reveal the full truth of your sister's crimes." Jaime's face grew cold, but there was a tremor of emotion, fear for his family, perhaps. "And what truth is that?" he asked. "That they are all bastards born of incest," Robert spat, the words echoing across the throne room. Several lords flinched at the direct accusation. Jaime's face turned stony, but there was nothing he could say to refute it. The rumors were too well known. "Tell me, Kingslayer," Robert said, "do you truly believe your father can seat one of your bastards on my throne?" Jaime said nothing for a long while. Then he glanced around, saw the assembly was all men loyal to the king. He looked at Ned Stark, who stared at him with open contempt. Finally, Jaime said quietly, "I see there will be no peace in this way." Robert let the silence hang. "Tell your father, if he lifts a sword against me, I will end House Lannister." Jaime left in haste. The realm braced. Every raven that left King's Landing flew with a sense of finality. War would come in the spring if neither side backed down. Ned tried once more to persuade Robert to compromise, to spare the realm. But Robert was resolute that if he compromised now, the next generation would suffer a Lannister-dominated throne. "Let the gods judge," Robert said. "I will not run from a fight. Not again." For all his posturing, a heaviness weighed on the king. He summoned Jon to his solar one evening, bidding him drink watered wine with him. "When the battle horns blow," Robert said, "you'll not fight in the vanguard. You're too valuable." Jon looked affronted, for he had never stepped away from a fight. "Spare me your honor," Robert growled. "I will not risk you. If I fall, you must keep the realm together. Ned will guide you. Hell, the boy Robb in the north is near your age, you'll have him as an ally. But you cannot die on the battlefield for my pride." Jon nodded reluctantly, though inside he felt a swirl of emotions he could barely name. He did not wish to see blood spilled on his account. He had never aspired to be king or hold power, but fate had thrust him here. In a quiet voice, Jon said, "If there's another way, we should take it. Too many men died in the rebellion." Robert grimaced. "You speak like Ned. Perhaps you're right, but Tywin Lannister, he knows only force, and I will not step aside again." Then he sighed so deeply it was as if the weight of the entire realm was on his broad shoulders. "Gods, I wish your mother were here. She'd set me straight if she could see how I've handled things." Jon, feeling the old heartbreak swirl around them, placed a hand on Robert's arm. He did not know what to say, only that in that moment he felt empathy for the king. Then, when the dawn came that might herald war, word arrived from the west. Tywin Lannister's host had halted. Some said a fever had seized him, others whispered that new negotiations were afoot. Tyrion Lannister was rumored to have convinced his father that an open assault on King's Landing, with House Stark, House Tully, and House Arryn rallying behind Robert, would lead to a ruinous war indeed. Perhaps the Lannisters might call for a council to mediate. Perhaps they had learned caution from the last time a mad king sat the throne. So, for a moment, the realm held its breath. The storm did not break as swiftly as all had feared. Robert thanked the gods in a private moment. He turned to Ned. "Let us see if we can end this without more blood," he said. "I'm tired, Ned. I'm tired." Slowly, a fragile peace took shape. Both sides recognized that a war would ravage the land. Robert was firm that Jon would remain named heir. Tywin insisted that Joffrey not be declared a bastard. The king, after much consideration, declared to the realm that for reasons of personal disenchantment and irreconcilable differences, he was officially disinheriting Joffrey but not naming him a bastard. He gave Joffrey a minor keep in the Crownlands to hold in courtesy, a face-saving measure. Myrcella and Tommen would remain in the line of succession after Jon if Jon failed to provide heirs of his own. But the king's official stance was that he believed Joffrey unfit for the throne. The entire realm knew the subtext, but the delicacy was enough for Tywin to back down rather than endure open confrontation. Cersei spat venom at such an arrangement, but Tywin forced her to accept it. He recognized that any official confession of incest would bring the full might of the realm upon his house. This half-measure, humiliating as it was, at least saved face enough for the Lannisters to remain a major power. Joffrey would fume in his new keep, but he would be alive and remain recognized as a royal, if not the crown prince. The realm, collectively exhaling, seemed grateful to avoid another war. In that battered peace, the king gave further recognition to Jon as the direct descendant of Lyanna Stark, naming him Jon of the House Stark, rightful son of Lyanna, and my beloved ward. Some bold tongues whispered that he was also Rhaegar's son, but the king refused to address that. Let them whisper. Ned Stark was content that Jon had a name, a place, and more hope than he'd ever had as a snow in Winterfell. Robert, for his part, felt the old ghost of Lyanna's memory shift from torment to a bittersweet ache that he could endure. Days turned to weeks, and the realm settled into a new shape. Jon accompanied Ned Stark back to Winterfell for a visit. As the royal heir, he had a new retinue of soldiers, but Jon never felt so free as when he passed through the familiar gates of Winterfell. The chill in the air felt like home. Robb embraced him, calling him brother still, and Sansa greeted him more politely than she ever had before, now that he stood so high in rank. Arya nearly tackled him with a hug, complaining that he'd been too long gone. Bran and Rickon looked at him with curious eyes, seeing him in finer clothes than they ever remembered. And yet Jon felt the same, still uncertain, still grappling with who he was. Only now he carried the knowledge that his mother was Lyanna Stark, that the Targaryen blood in his veins might one day mean more responsibility than he ever imagined. Ned Stark watched the reunion from the shadows, a weight lifting from his heart. He had done as Lyanna asked. He had protected Jon. And now Robert, surprisingly, had honored her memory by not only sparing the boy but allowing him a chance at real purpose. The old conflicts between House Stark and the Crown had been averted by Robert's refusal to die in that hunting field, by his refusal to let old hatred consume him entirely, and by the boy's calm sense of duty inherited from the North. Life continued. In the capital, Cersei endured a marriage more hateful than before, plotting quietly, but contained by Robert's and Tywin's arrangement. Jaime was forced to remain in King's Landing, sworn to keep the peace, his arrogance tempered by the knowledge that all eyes were on him. Tyrion found new opportunities at court, slyly advising the king on matters that required a sharper wit, forging a strange alliance with the newly minted heir in small ways, sharing jests over the madness of the capital. Joffrey brooded in his keep, occasionally stirring trouble, but overshadowed by Jon's acceptance among the court. For Jon, each day was a lesson in statecraft, forging alliances, hearing grievances, traveling the roads of the Crownlands to learn how the small folk fared. He wrote letters to Maester Aemon at the Wall, inquiring about the situation in the far north, the rumors of wildlings gathering, of the others stirring in the darkness. The old Maester's replies were full of cautious dread. The White Walkers might be real. The Night's Watch needed men, needed help. Jon, anxious, brought these concerns to Robert. The king, mindful of his old friend Ned's caution, agreed to send more supplies north, though many lords scoffed at the notion of walking corpses. But Jon pressed on, remembering what he had seen in his short time at the Wall. He could not forget the haunted look in the eyes of his fellow Black brothers. If the others threatened the realm, then the realm needed unity. Perhaps that was the real reason the gods had spared Robert, so that he might unify the kingdoms before the true threat emerged. Months passed. A peace, uneasy but real, bound Westeros. The seeds of war might still lie dormant, but for now the king's last-ditch compromise with the Lannisters held. And slowly the king's respect for Jon deepened. He would sit in the throne room and watch as Jon, under Ned's supervision, deliberated minor disputes, learning the burdens of justice. He would smile grimly when Jon showed the same streak of mercy Ned often had. Sometimes, in the evenings, Robert would speak of the future, of the day Jon would take the throne, how he should mind the impulses that had led so many kings astray. Jon would listen carefully, his face solemn. Once, in a rare moment of closeness, Robert admitted, "When I first learned who your father was, I wanted to kill you. I wanted to snuff out the last trace of that dragon's pawn." He took a deep breath. "But there's more Stark in you than Targaryen, I see that now. And even if there wasn't, you're Lyanna's. I can't hate Lyanna's child. I won't. She deserved better from me." Jon bowed his head. "Thank you, your grace. I never sought to be your heir. I only ever wanted to know who I truly was." Robert placed a warm, heavy hand on Jon's shoulder. "You'll be a better king than me one day," he said, voice thick with emotion he tried to hide beneath a grin. "Gods know that's no high bar. But I believe it." With those words, fatherless though Jon was, he felt a measure of acceptance he had never known. Perhaps this was the best gift Robert Baratheon could grant the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna: absolution, a place in the realm, a chance to lead not through conquest or fear, but by weaving the Stark sense of duty with a newfound compassion gleaned from the king's own regrets. Ned Stark, observing from the side, felt the wheel of fate turning in a direction none would have foreseen. The great rivalry between the dragon and the stag had ended in an uneasy sort of alliance, bound together by Lyanna Stark's legacy. The realm, battered by old wars and resentments, might now find an unexpected hope in the young man who had once stood upon the wall, resigned to a life of black cloaks and solitude. Of course, none could say what the future held. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons grew stronger, forging a path that might one day cross with Jon's. In the north, the cold winds still blew, and the threat of the others loomed in the minds of those who believed the old tales. The Lannisters, licking their wounds, would not remain cowed forever, for Tywin's pride was legendary and Joffrey's fury simmered like a hidden fire. Yet for the time being, under King Robert's rule, Westeros breathed a little easier. No new open war erupted. The king's near-death had changed the tide of destiny. Instead of darkness, a glimmer of reconciliation lit the realm. And so it was that Robert Baratheon never died that fateful day in the forest. Instead, he lived to unravel the greatest lie of his reign and to discover, in the child of Lyanna Stark, an echo of the woman he had loved. By accepting Jon as heir, Robert bound the North and Crown together in a bond of shared loyalty. The conflicts that had splintered the realm, Stark versus Crown, Lannister versus Baratheon, did not vanish, but they were tempered enough to spare the kingdom from a bloody civil war. The winter winds might still be coming, but in the hush before that storm, there was at least a fragile unity anchored by a boy with gray eyes and a heavy destiny, and a king who, for once in his life, chose a path of mercy instead of vengeance. In the end, that fragile unity would be tested by the future. The day might come when Daenerys Targaryen landed on the shores of Westeros, her dragons blazing, and discovered that the blood of her house already sat poised to inherit the throne, albeit a boy who was as much Stark as Targaryen, who had found acceptance from the usurper she had been taught to despise. But that is another story, and for now, at least, Westeros exhaled, spared from immediate carnage. Guided by a king who had lived to correct his worst regrets and a boy who represented both the North's enduring honor and the lingering flame of House Targaryen. And if sometimes, in the quiet hush of the Red Keep's gardens, Robert Baratheon closed his eyes and thought he saw Lyanna smiling, the moment was fleeting, gone in a swirl of flower-scented breeze. But he would open his eyes to see Jon, young, strong, and honorable, and remember that he was living proof that not every dream had to die in blood and darkness. Sometimes, if the gods were kind, a new dream could rise, carrying the old hopes upon its shoulders, daring to step forward with the promise of a better realm. In the weeks and moons that followed King Robert's momentous decision to name Jon, the one-time Snow of Winterfell, as his heir, the realm found itself in a precarious peace. King's Landing drew a collective breath of relief at the prospect that open war with House Lannister might be avoided. And yet, under the surface, tensions churned like a riptide. Courtiers whispered about Tywin Lannister's pride and Joffrey's hatred, while rumors of the boy with Stark and Targaryen blood kindled new sparks of gossip each day. In the Red Keep, every corridor seemed fraught with watchful eyes. Yet even in that maze of intrigue, a sense of muted hope took hold, as though a violent storm had narrowly passed, leaving the city battered but still standing. On some afternoons, King Robert could be glimpsed in the training yards, watching Jon train at swordplay or archery, silently measuring him. It was as if Robert himself could not believe how thoroughly fate had twisted in so short a span, how the near death of a king and the revealing of an old secret could change the entire course of Westeros. Jon lived in uneasy wonder at his new circumstance. The days in King's Landing were full of duties and lessons. He had never desired titles or crowns. The sight of the Iron Throne still sent a chill through him, a swirl of awe and dread. There were times, usually in the hush of early morning, when he remembered the biting cold of the Wall, the brotherhood of the Night's Watch, and felt the ache of leaving it behind. He still wrote letters to Samwell Tarly and Maester Aemon, continuing to gather what scraps he could about rumors of the wildlings and the possibility of the others. In return, letters from the Wall described new sightings in the haunted forest, glimpses of pale shadows, disappearance of rangers, signs of uneasy stirrings. Maester Aemon hinted that the Night's Watch was desperately short of both men and resources. The old Maester's words bristled with quiet alarm, as though each letter carried an unspoken plea. Jon read those missives by candlelight, then folded them carefully and tucked them away. At times, he would meet King Robert or Lord Eddard Stark in private, telling them what little he knew: the Watch needs more men. The wildlings are restless, and there's talk of something worse in the far north. Robert would frown and mutter about old stories of Snarks and Grumpkins. But Ned Stark's face was more somber. "We should send more supplies," he agreed. "No harm can come of shoring up the Watch." Robert, mindful of preserving a fragile peace, did not wish to rally too large a host from the Crownlands or Stormlands and risk stoking Tywin Lannister's suspicions. Yet he did quietly dispatch wagons of grain and cloth to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, ensuring that word might spread through the realm that the king was paying heed to the north. He also directed a handful of new recruits to the Wall, criminals otherwise bound for the headsman's axe, and a few volunteers from lesser houses who were promised royal favor. It was not nearly enough to satisfy the Night's Watch, but it was more than they had seen in many years. Meanwhile, as if to balance that small act of good, the political tensions that had almost led to civil war still simmered. Joffrey lingered in his newly bestowed holdfast in the Crownlands, breeding resentment. Men whispered of the humiliations he had endured, the wine-fueled duel with Jon, the king's decree that disinherited him without outright naming him a bastard. Often Joffrey slipped away from that holdfast to visit the capital in disguise, escorted by a handful of loyal guards, sowing seeds of rumor among the more malleable petty lords. Though only a boy, Joffrey's cunning was sharpened by the sting of wounded pride. Cersei, in the Red Keep, seldom appeared at court. She rarely joined the king for royal functions and was often found in her private chambers or in the company of her daughter Myrcella and youngest son Tommen. Grand Maester Pycelle reported that the queen was prone to fits of despair and sudden bursts of rage. Rumors circulated that she had tried to beg Tywin for a final recourse, some means of wresting the crown back for Joffrey. But Tywin, from the distance of Casterly Rock, had made it plain in so many words that he would not bring the West to open war unless he was certain the realm would turn on the king. And so far, few lords wished to do so, not after the bloodshed of the Greyjoy Rebellion, the scouring of the Riverlands during Robert's own uprising, and the lingering scars from the War of the Nine Penny Kings. Cersei, thus checked, could only resent from behind castle walls. Even so, Jon was not blind to the quiet threats. He could feel the way her gaze followed him when they crossed paths. Once, passing her in the corridor near the royal sept, he felt a chill. She regarded him with narrowed green eyes and a sneer twisting her lips. "Do you think yourself safe?" she murmured, so quietly only he could hear. "A bastard from the far north, set above my true-born children." Jon let out a long breath. He had grown more confident since his first weeks in King's Landing. "I am sorry for the pain this causes you," he said, a response that made her sneer deepen. "What a pious little wolf you are," she replied. "But I know what you are. I know who fathered you. The day will come when that truth swallows you whole." Though her words stung, Jon only bowed stiffly and let her pass. Afterward, he stood outside, letting the warm southern wind comb through his dark hair, remembering the unyielding cold of the wall and the simpler camaraderie of Castle Black life. Yet not all eyes upon him were so hostile. He found a wary friendship, if one could call it that, in Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf who often haunted the Red Keep in those days. Tyrion, for all his familial loyalties, recognized that the game had changed. He would sometimes appear at the training yard and watch Jon's sword practice or approach him in the library where Jon pored over old tomes of Westerosi history. They had a brief exchange one day, when Tyrion found Jon absorbed in an account of King Mikar's reign. Tyrion cleared his throat softly. A Targaryen who was also part of House Stark's line. That would be a novelty, wouldn't it? Jon set the book aside, measuring Tyrion with careful eyes. "So people say," he allowed. "You don't seem to doubt it." Tyrion gave a small, ironic smile. "I found that in this city, the truth is often stranger than the rumors. And you, dear boy, are the strangest truth yet." Jon felt a flicker of resentment but swallowed it. Tyrion's tone was not unkind. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No, I imagine you did not." Tyrion's mismatched eyes gleamed. "You might remember that truth. Plenty of my kin might wish to see you undone, but I suspect we'd be in a better realm if men didn't kill each other over trifles of parentage and broken betrothals. Still, I hope you appreciate what the king does for you or tries to do in his own stumbling manner." Jon nodded. "I do. He has been kinder than I expected, given all that happened." Tyrion's lips curved wryly. "Robert Baratheon is full of surprises. Let us hope he has enough surprises left to keep the peace. I am no warrior, Jon, if I may call you Jon, but I know that if the West and the Crown come to arms, many innocents will die. It would be wise to keep an eye on Joffrey's new forays into the city. He stirs the pot, and there are always eager petty lords who smell power in a disaffected princeling." Jon swallowed. "Thank you for the warning." "Warning?" "Merely an observation," Tyrion said, inclining his head. Then he turned away, whistling a jaunty tune that echoed curiously off the stone walls, leaving Jon to think about the precariousness of his newfound station. Late that evening, Jon found himself pacing the narrow walkway along the Red Keep's outer ramparts, looking down upon Blackwater Bay. Torches danced in the harbor, flickering on the water's surface. A hush blanketed the city beneath the starry sky. Jon had come to realize there was something lonely about being named heir. Even the sense of belonging that had flickered in his chest when Robert or Ned praised him felt overshadowed by the knowledge that everything was subject to the Game of Thrones. On the morrow, Ned Stark was returning north to see to matters in Winterfell, but Robert insisted that Jon remain in the south for now, continuing his education. The king wanted him to learn the intricacies of ruling, how to deal with courtiers, how to survive the labyrinth of the small council, how to project authority without stumbling into tyranny. Jon longed for the crisp air of the north, the comforting gloom of Winterfell's halls, the faces of his half-siblings who knew him simply as their brother. At dawn the next day, he rose to see Lord Stark off. Ned gently rested a hand on Jon's shoulder. They stood by the royal stables where Ned's escort had gathered. Robb Stark and the younger ones had departed earlier that season, so Ned's traveling companions were mostly men-at-arms and loyal bannermen. "Your mother, my sister, would have been proud," Ned said quietly, voice thick with an emotion Jon had rarely heard in the stoic lord. "But I know this isn't easy for you." "It isn't," Jon admitted. "Sometimes I wish the king had never named me heir, or that he'd left me at the wall." Ned pressed his lips together. But you see how it needed to be done. Robert's rightful heirs with Cersei are no heirs at all. Better this path than plunging the realm into chaos, though the realm, as ever, teeters on the brink. Jon studied his uncle's face, the guarded lines of worry. I'll do my best to keep the peace. I know you will, said Ned. And should you ever have need of the North, we are yours. Always remember that. Then, in a rare gesture of public affection, Ned clasped Jon in a strong embrace, like a father might clasp a beloved son. Jon felt emotion well up, gratitude, love, loss. He had missed that closeness ever since learning the truth of his parentage. He watched Lord Stark ride out with the solemn clop of horses' hooves echoing against the stone courtyard. Then he took a deep breath and turned back into the labyrinth of the Red Keep. Already, King Robert would be in the throne room or else closeted with the small council dealing with the endless tasks of governance, tasks he had once famously shirked until they piled up. Now, though, Robert had grown oddly dutiful. The brush with death and the revelations that followed seemed to have galvanized him with a blend of remorse and determination. Jon found Robert in the small council chamber, brow furrowed as he listened to Lord Renly, his younger brother, discuss the financial burdens of the crown. Littlefinger was there as well, leaning casually against the wall, a glimmer of calculation in his gray-green eyes. Varys hovered like a specter by the windows, soft-footed, a faint smile on his lips. Grand Maester Pycelle and Ser Barristan and Selmy completed the gathering, each carrying an air of tension. There you are, lad, Robert said with a nod when Jon entered. Come join us. It's time you learned just how deep in debt your kingdom stands. Jon took a seat at the far end of the table, feeling the weight of so many gazes upon him. Your Grace, my lords, he acknowledged. Renly sighed dramatically, blowing a lock of black hair off his brow. The K.I.N.G. is not jesting, Jon. The crown owes vast sums to the Iron Bank of Bravos. And these sums have only grown in recent years. Littlefinger piped up. Thankfully, we have means to juggle the debts, as we always do. If the realm remains at peace, we can balance the shortfalls in due course. Robert scowled. I always despise dealing with coin and ledgers. But if I'm to keep this realm afloat, I must. We have new expenditures, sending supplies north, fortifying roads in the Crownlands. And we're still recovering from the cost of the Greyjoy Rebellion and my own extravagances. A faint hush fell as Robert allowed a hint of self-reproach to creep into his tone. Perhaps in years past, he would have roared or tossed his hands in frustration. Now, he seemed to endure the lecture stoically. Then there is the matter of the West, Varys said in his silken voice, clasping his plump hands. I hear Lord Tywin invests heavily in forging alliances with certain lords of the Reach. He entertains them lavishly at Casterly Rock, reminding them how tenuous peace can be. At that, Robert glowered. The Reach is sworn to House Tyrell. Mace Tyrell is a vain fool, but not likely to risk war if the king's justice is upheld. Still, we must watch carefully. Tywin will not rest while his grandchildren are overshadowed by my nephew. Jon stiffened slightly at the word nephew, but he remembered that Robert called him that in public. It was safer than naming him a Targaryen. Safer, especially in the presence of the small council where not everyone could be trusted even if the truth was widely suspected. Littlefinger's cunning eyes flicked toward Jon. Young heir, if I may be so bold, it might be prudent to engage in a progress of sorts, journey to the major houses to reassure them of your goodwill. Sometimes a personal appearance and a few kind words can soothe lords who feel overlooked. They might be less inclined to align with the Lannisters if they see you are more than just a rumor. Jon glanced at Robert, uncertain. The idea of riding out to court the favor of lords unsettled him. He was no master of politics, and he suspected many in the realm would look upon him with suspicion. I am willing if his grace wishes it, Jon said carefully. Robert ran a hand through his thick hair, now peppered with streaks of white. Perhaps. Gods know I can't leave the capital for too long. If Tywin stirs trouble, I must be ready. But you could travel, boy, with a strong escort. Start with the Crownlands, the Stormlands, maybe the Reach if it can be done safely. Show them your face and your courtesy. Remind them what House Stark stands for. Ser Barristan spoke up then, his voice grave and measured. It might be wise, your grace, to ensure that if Lord Jon sets forth, he does so under the protection of knights and loyal bannermen. There are many who might wish to see him harmed. Robert nodded grimly. Indeed. Then he looked at Jon. Think on it. We'll speak more soon. For now, I must endure more talk of coin. Jon excused himself from the small council after the discussion turned back to the intricacies of crown finances. Though he understood the importance of the realm's coffers, he still felt at sea amid the squabbling of Master of Coin. master of laws, and so forth. He was relieved to find a moment's peace in the castle yard. Outside, the sun had climbed high, its warmth filtering through a scatter of thin clouds. Courtiers moved about in clumps, whispering, their silks rustling. The banners along the walls fluttered in a mild breeze. Jon sought the training yard, intending to clear his head with the ring of steel. But he found, to his surprise, that the yard was not empty. Arya Stark stood in the center, brandishing a wooden practice sword, while an exasperated master-at-arms corrected her stance. Arya was the only one of Ned's children who had remained in the capital after Ned's departure, for she wished to learn from a Braavosi water dancer. Ned had consented, having come to believe it might keep his headstrong daughter out of more dangerous trouble. Jon paused at the yard's edge, crossing his arms. Arya, hair pulled back in a messy braid, scowled in concentration as she tried to replicate the fluid movements of swordplay that her Braavosi teacher, Syrio Farrell, had once demonstrated. But that teacher was gone from King's Landing now, rumored to have left after an obscure dispute with a Pentoshi envoy. In his absence, the Red Keep's own master-at-arms was less patient and more accustomed to instructing knights in the standard forms. Arya caught sight of Jon. Her face lit with an eager grin, though it vanished when the master-at-arms barked at her to mind her footwork. Jon remembered the days in Winterfell when Arya would hide behind corners, watching him and Robb train. She had always yearned for the sword in a world that insisted she should prefer a sewing needle. When at last the session ended, Arya jogged over to Jon, face flushed. That man is hopeless. He wants me to hack like a lumbering knight. I'd rather move lightly, like a cat. Jon offered a small smile. You've always been quick. You'll learn what you can and adapt it. That's what a real swordsman does. She nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. How are you faring with all the councils and courtiers? He sighed, stepping aside to let a pair of guards pass. It's a different kind of training yard, full of hidden blows. I'm learning slowly, but I do miss the north. Arya exhaled, glancing down at her wooden sword. Me too. Sometimes I think about running away from here, just packing my things and fleeing out the gate. Jon's expression softened. I've had the same thought, but we must do our duty. Duty, Arya repeated, with the note of someone quoting a distasteful word. I suppose Father would say the same. Then, she studied Jon's face. You know, everyone keeps calling you a prince behind your back now. Even though they all know the official story is that you're only the king's heir through your mother. People in the castle sometimes say you're the Prince of Secrets. Silly talk, but they're in awe of you, Jon. Jon felt heat rise to his cheeks at that name. Let them talk. Most of them have no idea who I truly am. Arya touched his forearm gently. I do, she said, voice firm. We're family. If you go traveling the realm to woo these lords, be careful. Courtly flattery can turn dangerous. He mustered a smile. I will, little sister. Then he gave her a playful poke, as he had when she was smaller. Keep practicing. I'll spar with you sometime if the master-at-arms allows it. She brightened, and he headed off, feeling a measure of warmth from that exchange. For all that King's Landing represented, at least he had Arya, a reminder of simpler times in Winterfell. The very next fortnight, the matter of Jon's proposed progress came to fruition. The king decided that Jon should journey first to the Stormlands, to meet the lesser lords sworn to House Baratheon, then continue to the Reach if Mace Tyrell would host him. A show of respect, Robert explained, might keep the realm balanced. You'll be accompanied by a suitable retinue, Robert told him. Ser Barristan will go, along with a few dozen knights from the Kingsguard and the City Watch, men loyal to me. I'll not have you riding undefended. Jon agreed, though he harbored misgivings. He had never traveled beyond the North and King's Landing. The idea of presenting himself as heir to the Iron Throne, no matter what name they gave him, set him on edge. Still, he would do his duty. Cersei did not attend the send-off the day Jon and his escort rode from the capital. Joffrey was conspicuously absent as well. Sansa and Arya stood by, each looking for a farewell. Arya gave Jon a quick, fierce hug, Sansa performed a polite curtsy, her eyes gleaming with complicated emotions. "I hope you find the stormlands to your liking," she said. "I hear the coast is beautiful. Perhaps you'll write to us, so we can hear all about the storms and the—" She trailed off uncertainly, and Jon simply nodded, forced to realize how little he truly knew this sister who had always seemed more a lady in the southern style. With that, Jon swung into the saddle and joined the column riding out from the city gates. Ser Barristan donned plain armor for the journey, seeking to minimize any sense of threat. The old knight had a fatherly air, offering occasional words of encouragement to Jon. Behind them rode a carefully chosen mix of knights and lesser lords, men from families who had proven their loyalty to King Robert in the rebellion. It was a small but imposing band. Jon wore his sword at his hip, remembering the first time he had walked through those gates as a confused boy in black. The road to the Stormlands was long and winding, crossing the King's Wood and passing through rolling plains. In the early days of the ride, the men were in good spirits, sharing jests about tavern fare and the peculiarities of local folks. Jon, though still uneasy, found himself gradually settling into the cadence of the journey. He had grown used to traveling under the watchful eyes of older knights. In Winterfell, he had often been overshadowed by Robb, or left to brood as the so-called bastard. Now, ironically, he was the center of attention. People along the road would come out of small villages to gawk, having heard rumors of the king's heir. Along the way, Jon made a point of speaking with them. He introduced himself not with lofty claims but simply as Jon, ward of King Robert, and many folk warmed to his sincerity. They told him of bandits prowling the wood, of poor harvests, of local petty lords who quarreled over grazing rights. Jon listened carefully, took mental notes. Perhaps this was how a king should learn, by meeting the people he might one day serve. Late one afternoon, while the retinue camped by the banks of a broad, slow-moving river, Ser Barristan approached Jon as he practiced sword forms alone. The old knight's footsteps were silent on the grass, but Jon sensed him and turned. "You hold the blade well," Barristan remarked, his weathered face creasing with approval. "Your stance grows surer with each day." Jon lowered the sword. "Thank you, sir. I had good teachers at the wall and in the Red Keep." "Your skill is plain," Barristan continued, "but you must also learn the art of winning hearts without drawing steel. That is what these travels are truly about." Jon exhaled. "I know. King Robert wants me to unite the realm, or at least pave the way to unity, after all the turmoil." Barristan nodded, drawing nearer. "And so do I, my lord. I've served many kings. I know too well how fragile a kingdom can be under a weak or cruel ruler. Robert has his failings, but he cares for the realm in his own way. I see a different kind of hope in you, though I do not wish to burden you with great expectations." Jon gave a small smile, touched by the old knight's frankness. "If I fail, many will suffer. That is the truth of it." Barristan's gaze flicked to the trees, where shadows lengthened under a dusky sky. "But that is why you must see the realm with your own eyes. Know its people, learn its songs, its joys and sorrows." Then the knight's voice softened. "You remind me of a prince I once knew, unlike him in some ways, but like him in others." Jon tensed. "Rhaegar." Barristan's blue eyes lowered. I was his sworn shield for a time before the rebellion. He was a man of deep thought, always looking for a higher calling. Some say he was more bard than warrior, though I know he could fight like few others. You have that introspection in you, tempered by the stark sense of honor." The name of Rhaegar Targaryen set an old conflict twisting in Jon's heart. But Barristan's face reflected no condemnation. Instead, the knight seemed touched by some fond memory. "Be your own man, my lord," Barristan said gently. "Take the best lessons from those who came before you. Learn from their mistakes, and from their virtues." Jon inclined his head in gratitude. "Thank you, Ser Barristan. I will." They spoke no further of Rhaegar, but that conversation lingered in Jon's mind. The knowledge that Rhaegar had once been an honorable man, that he had been beloved by some, clashed with the fierce, hateful stories Robert had told of him. Jon found himself wishing, not for the first time, that he might have known Rhaegar, at least to discover what in him had drawn Lyanna Stark's heart away from Robert Baratheon. They continued southward, crossing through the stormlands' wind-lashed terrain, where jagged cliffs met the sea. The storms that gave the land its name battered them at times, rain drumming on their tents and thunder shaking the earth. Jon had never seen storms quite like this in the north, and he watched lightning dance on the horizon with a mixture of awe and apprehension. At last, they reached the stronghold of Storm's End, the ancient seat of House Baratheon. It was a towering fortress perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, its thick walls said to have been raised by the legendary Bran the Builder. Renly Baratheon, who had traveled on ahead after the small council meeting, stood at the gates to welcome Jon's retinue, flanked by a small gathering of knights and bannermen. Renly was all smiles as he greeted Jon. He had a certain charm about him, with his easy wit and fashionable attire. "Welcome, my lord," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "Storm's End is pleased to receive the king's favored nephew." Jon dismounted. "Thank you, Lord Renly. It's an honor to see the seat of House Baratheon." Renly's grin widened. "I suppose you must be half a Baratheon yourself these days, or so the realm claims." He said it lightly enough, though there was an undercurrent that made Jon suspect Renly's ambitions had not been entirely buried. Jon recalled that Renly had once, in hushes, been rumored to covet the throne if Robert died. But at present, with Robert alive and the realm tentatively stable, Renly played the role of loyal brother. They entered the great hall of Storm's End, with its soaring stone vaults and sturdy, unornamented design, a testament to the castle's famed defenses. Renly had organized a welcoming feast, smaller than the lavish spectacles of King's Landing, but lively enough. The thunder outside lent drama to the flickering torches and the bright banners that draped from the walls. During the feast, Jon sat at the high table with Renly, Barristan, and several local lords who had come to pay respects. The talk was of harvest yields, the recent storms, and the new trade routes developing with Essos. Occasionally, a lull in conversation hung awkwardly over them, as though some unspoken question lingered. Should we treat this young man as the crown prince or simply as a favored ward? Jon navigated it with humility, answering inquiries about the king's health and confiding that Robert planned to keep a steady hand on the realm. He was careful not to appear too eager to command these men, many of whom were older and more seasoned. Instead, he asked after their families, their concerns, letting them see he wished to learn. Some seemed impressed, others guarded. Renly, drinking freely, nudged Jon at one point and leaned in to speak above the din. "They'll come around," he murmured. "Some of them fought for Robert in the rebellion, but they question how well a Stark-blooded boy can represent the stag. You'll show them in time." Jon nodded, feeling that weight again, the sense that every word, every gesture was a test. He looked down the table and caught Ser Barristan's approving glance. The old knight gave the slightest nod, as if to say, "Stay the course." When the feast concluded, Renly and Jon retired to a smaller solar, away from the bustle. Lightning flashed in the narrow window, illuminating a set of carved chairs and a sturdy wooden table. A pair of servants brought wine, then vanished, leaving the two men alone. Renly swirled the wine in his cup. "You handled yourself well tonight. They're a rowdy bunch, the Stormlords, fiercely loyal but prideful. My brother always swore that if you have the Stormlords, you hold a sword by the hilt. Lose them, and that same sword runs you through." Jon considered the metaphor. "I'm grateful for your advice, Lord Renly. Do you truly think we can keep the realm at peace with Tywin Lannister looming in the west?" Renly gave a half-shrug, tipping back his cup. "Tywin Lannister is formidable, but so long as your presence does not threaten the Lannister coffers or pride too brazenly, he may bide his time. A year, 2, perhaps 5. In that time, if the realm grows to accept you, if you gain the love of the people and the respect of the lords, then even Tywin's gold won't be enough to spark another rebellion." Jon thought of Joffrey, brooding in his keep, sowing discontent. What if that acceptance never comes? "Then we'll be mired in war soon enough," Renly said bluntly. "But let's not dwell on gloom. Storm's End is your home too, if you want it. Let the Lord see you ride along the coasts. Listen to their troubles. Offer them a sense that House Baratheon stands behind them as it always has. Jon managed a small smile. Thank you, Lord Renly. I'll remember that. Renly's green eyes flicked to the window, where thunder crashed again. A flicker of something pensive crossed his face, as if he recalled memories of storms endured in his youth. The nights can be loud here, but you'll grow used to it. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we'll begin your tour of the keep, and from there we can arrange visits to a handful of our nearest bannermen. Jon bowed his head in polite gratitude. They parted ways, and Jon went to the chamber prepared for him, a modest room by princely standards but comfortable enough with thick walls that shuddered faintly under the wind's assault. He spent half the night listening to the roar of the storm outside before finally drifting into a restless sleep. Over the next several days, Jon immersed himself in the stormlands. He rode out with Ser Barristan and a handful of knights, guided by Lord Renly's men. They visited local villages where hardy folk endured the unrelenting squalls. Jon forced himself to ask about their trade, their safety, bandit troubles. Sometimes the people were overawed, other times they regarded, uncertain if this young man was truly destined to rule. But Jon listened attentively, and more than once he managed to offer small assistance, ordering that a portion of the king's own wagons bring salted fish or seed grain to villages that had been battered by storms. He discovered a sense of fulfillment in those small gestures of mercy. Rather than parading about in knightly splendor, he labored beside the villagers when a flash flood threatened one hamlet's fields, helping stack sandbags and direct the flow of water. Ser Barristan cautioned him not to take unnecessary risks, but Jon insisted that if he was to be a king, he should understand the hardship of the small folk firsthand. When word of that spread, of the king's heir muddying his boots to save a few fields, it softened some hearts. Still, not everyone was convinced. At times, banners from lesser lords drifted into camp, men with stern faces who would measure Jon with flinty eyes, their greetings stiff. They remembered Robert Baratheon as a young Warhammer-wielding warrior, towering and full of laughter. Jon, though skilled with a sword, was quieter, not as brash, more reserved. A different breed of leader. Some found that intriguing, others found it unsettling. In the evenings, Jon returned to Storm's End, where Renly hosted small suppers. On one such evening, Jon noted a guest of rank, Lady Brienne of Tarth, visiting from her Sapphire Isle. She was a tall, strongly built woman in plain garb, her features broad and earnest. Jon had heard rumors that she fought as well as any knight. Renly introduced her with warmth, praising her skill and courage. Jon greeted her politely, intrigued by how she defied the typical southern expectations of ladylike behavior. She was shy, stumbling over her words, yet her gaze was fearless. During the meal, Jon found a moment to speak with Brienne more privately. My Lord Father, Lord Selwyn, bade me pay respects to Lord Renly, she explained in a low voice. I've long admired him. He's always been kind to me. Jon nodded. He values loyalty and valor, I think. Qualities you seem to have in abundance. She blinked as though embarrassed by the compliment. Thank you, my lord. You are not what I expected. In what way? He asked. I heard you were the king's nephew, but also that you carry Targaryen blood. Some call you the Wolf Prince, others the Prince of Secrets. Her cheeks colored. I wasn't sure if you'd be haughty or cruel, but you seem sincere. Jon appreciated her honesty. I only try to be myself. She studied him for a moment and then gave a short nod as if deciding that he was worthy of respect. If you have need of a loyal sword, I would be honored to serve. I know many knights might mock a woman in armor, but I've bested more than a few. He believed her. I'll keep that in mind, my lady, he said, meaning it. Somehow Brienne's straightforwardness calmed the swirl of politicking around him. The moon rose full above Storm's End that night, the wind easing to a distant moan. Jon walked alone along the castle ramparts, gazing over the moonlit sea. He thought about the distances that spanned the realm, from the icy wall to the parched Dornish sands, from the western hills to the Vale's mountains. All of it, in some sense, might become his responsibility one day. The weight of that possibility pressed on him, and he found he could not quite breathe at the thought. He wondered how Ned Stark had borne such responsibilities for Winterfell all those years, and how Robert bore them for the Seven Kingdoms. Perhaps the burden was easier to bear if you were born and raised to it, but Jon had come to this fate only by chance, by a secret promise in the Tower of Joy, by Ned's fierce protection, by Robert's near-fatal boar hunt. An uneasy swirl of destiny and chance. A few more days passed. Jon continued to meet local lords, forging a tenuous bond with them. Then, at Renly's urging, they made plans to journey west into the Reach where Highgarden beckoned. Mace Tyrell had sent a polite missive inviting the king's heir to see the famed gardens and to discuss prospects for mutual prosperity, which, in Mace's flowery language, generally meant alliances or marriage pacts. Jon worried about entering the sphere of House Tyrell, where political dealings could be as elaborate as any courtly ballad. Yet Barristan and Renly both agreed that forging good ties with the Tyrells might deter them from any secret arrangement with the Lannisters. Robert had made it clear that the realm needed the Tyrells in check if it hoped to keep Tywin Lannister from mustering a coalition. So they set off again, riding from the stormlands into the warm, fertile lands of the Reach. The difference in climate was stark. Where the stormlands were battered by wind and rain, the Reach was lush and gentle, full of rolling hills and fields bursting with wheat and barley. As they neared Highgarden, they passed orchards of apples, peaches, and pears. Jon inhaled the scent of blossoms on the breeze, admiring the open farmland. Some part of him understood why House Tyrell boasted of its wealth and bounty. The cradle of chivalry, they called it, where knights and ladies danced at endless feasts. He recalled Sansa's starry-eyed mentions of Highgarden gleaned from songs. But he also knew the Tyrells were formidable. It was said that Mace Tyrell's bannermen could muster an army nearly as large as the combined forces of the Crownlands and the Stormlands. If they turned against the throne, it would be a devastating conflict. When they finally glimpsed Highgarden, it seemed a place out of a story, graceful towers rising amid terraces of flowering vines and sculpted hedges, a fortress at heart, but cloaked in beauty. The river Mander curled around it, thick with trade barges and fishing boats. Mace Tyrell greeted them in the courtyard, his girth enclosed in a tunic embroidered with golden roses. His booming voice echoed off the stone. Beside him stood his sons and daughters Loras Tyrell, the famed Knight of Flowers, and Garland Tyrell, less renowned but solid and dependable, as well as Margaery Tyrell, a girl of perhaps 16 with a poised, knowing air and warm brown eyes. Ser Loras stepped forward and bowed, his curls shining in the sun. "Welcome to Highgarden, my lord," he said courteously to Jon. "We're honored to host you." Jon remembered hearing tales of Loras's prowess in tournaments. He dipped his head in return. "Thank you, Ser Loras. The fame of Highgarden precedes it." Mace Tyrell let out a thunderous laugh. "We do our best to make an impression, boy. Now come inside, rest from your journey. A feast awaits, and then we'll show you what wonders our gardens hold." Jon dismounted, feeling the swirl of new courtiers around him. This was a different atmosphere from the Stormlands. Everything at Highgarden seemed bright, aromatic, almost intoxicating. He could see that Barristan and Renly both wore guarded smiles, well aware that behind the welcoming facade, House Tyrell played at the same great game as the rest. After a short respite in assigned chambers, the feast began. Music filled the grand hall, harps and lutes weaving a melody that made the place feel more like a garden party than a fortress. Garlands of flowers hung from pillars and the servants wore floral emblems pinned to their tunics. Platters of fresh fruit and roasted game paraded across the trestle tables while courtiers mingled in a swirl of perfumes and shimmering silks. Jon was seated at the high table beside Margaery Tyrell. She spoke softly but with a confidence beyond her years. "Welcome, my lord. I've heard much of you from King's Landing." Jon inclined his head politely. "I fear you've likely heard a muddle of rumors." She smiled, dimples forming. "Rumors, yes. But also some encouraging tales. That you saved a village in the Stormlands from flooding, for instance. And that you prefer to learn from the small folk rather than have them serve you in fear." Jon felt a faint flush. "I only did what anyone should do." Margaery's eyes flicked to the swirl of dancers taking the floor below. "In the Reach, chivalry is prized, but there is sometimes a gap between the songs and the reality. It's refreshing to hear of an heir who values more than just pageantry." Her manner was gracious, but Jon sensed a subtle depth. Margaery might be younger, yet she seemed perceptive, the type to glean more information from a simple chat than many lords would from hours of interrogation. He had heard rumors that she was cunning in her own right, a budding rose with hidden thorns. Throughout the feast, Mace Tyrell boomed with compliments about King Robert, about Ned Stark, about the generosity of House Baratheon. Lord Garland chimed in occasionally with more measured remarks, though Loras seemed content to smile at his sister's conversation with Jon. Renly, for his part, bantered easily with the Tyrells, an old friendship apparent. Renly and Loras had ties that, rumor said, went beyond mere brotherhood in arms. Jon found the atmosphere heady. The sweet wines made him drowsy, and the swirl of flowery scents made him think fleetingly of Sansa's tales of a fairy tale southern kingdom. But he remained vigilant, remembering Barristan's words about hearts and steel. Toward the end of the feast, Mace Tyrell cleared his throat loudly. My lords and ladies, I should like to share a small notion with our honored guest, the king's nephew. He paused for effect, letting the hall quiet. It has been suggested that if the realm is to endure in peace, the great houses must stand together. As father to a fair maiden of marrying age, I wonder if we might see some blossoming friendship between House Tyrell and our dear Wolf Prince. The reference to Wolf Prince set tongues wagging among the assembled. Jon felt a surge of discomfort. He glimpsed Marjorie's expression, calm, perhaps a slight flush, but no visible shock. She must have known her father would broach the topic. Renly raised his goblet, eyes twinkling with mischief. An interesting notion indeed, my lord. House Baratheon has always been close to Highgarden, and now House Stark is joined to the Baratheons through young Jon. A marriage alliance could strengthen the entire realm. Jon's cheeks heated, though he tried to keep his composure. I am honored by the suggestion, he said diplomatically. Though such decisions rest with King Robert as well as with Lord Stark, my mother's brother. Mace beamed, taking Jon's carefully phrased reply as a sign of open discussion. Of course. This is but a seed of an idea, waiting to be nurtured. We wouldn't dream of pressing you, but press him they did in subtler ways. Over the next several days, as Jon lingered at Highgarden, Marjorie was frequently at his side, guiding him through the famed gardens, pointing out rare flowers, gracefully inquiring about his likes and dislikes. Jon could not deny she was intelligent and poised, easy to converse with. She possessed a quick wit that reminded him, oddly, of Tyrion Lannister, though far more polished in presentation. He found himself torn. He had never envisioned marriage as part of his future, back when he was simply Jon Snow, a would-be brother of the Night's Watch. Now the notion of wedding alliances was thrust upon him as if it were the most natural matter in the world. He admitted to himself that Marjorie Tyrell seemed a good match by Southern standards, a girl who understood politics and carried herself with surprising warmth. Yet a corner of his heart yearned for freedom, for the crisp northern air and simpler ties. It also reminded him how little he truly knew of love or romance, beyond half-remembered glimpses from the vantage of Winterfell's halls. Could he trust himself to choose wisely, or was that choice even truly his? Ser Barristan observed from a distance, caution etched in his weathered features. Late one evening, he found Jon alone by a fountain in Highgarden's lower courtyard. The fountain was ringed by moonlit lilies, their pale blossoms reflecting in the water. Barristan approached softly. Mace Tyrell has made his interest plain. Is the prospect pleasing to you? Jon sighed. Marjorie is kind, and she seems capable, but I barely know her, and there is so much else to consider. The Lannisters, the realm, the threat from beyond the wall. Barristan nodded. Marriage among nobles is seldom simple, my lord. It is a contract, a binding of alliances. Affection can bloom or not. Many would say Marjorie Tyrell is a coveted bride for any would-be king. Jon dipped his fingers into the cool fountain water. I suppose so, but I don't want to be a piece to be married off for convenience, no matter how charming the bride might be. Barristan's gaze held a rare flicker of sympathy. You are not the first heir to feel that way, nor will you be the last. King Robert himself. Well, you know how that marriage fared. Jon thought of Robert and Cersei, a union built on politics and illusions. That's exactly what I fear. A loveless arrangement that fosters resentment. But it need not be that way, Barristan said softly. Marjorie is not Cersei, and you are not Robert. If the time comes when the king and Lord Stark press you to marry, you might find it less of a burden if you approach it with an open heart. For now, though, it is only a possibility, not a command. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hush of the courtyard envelop him. Thank you for your counsel, Ser Barristan. The old knight inclined his head. Rest well, my lord. The Tyrells know how to lavish hospitality, but never forget that they, too, are players in this game. Not long after that conversation, a raven arrived from King's Landing, bearing news that unsettled them all. Robert's letter was curt. Tywin Lannister had hosted a grand tourney at Lannisport, presumably to celebrate the anniversaries of certain victories. Whispers from Varys suggested that Tywin was using the occasion to cement alliances and gauge support for the Lannisters against the crown. Robert commanded Jon to remain in the Reach for now, continuing his diplomatic mission but also to stay vigilant. Let the Tyrells see that the crown values them, Robert wrote, but do not promise anything binding without my leave. Beware Mace's flattery. If he tries to press for a betrothal, stall. I have matters to settle first. Also, I hear that Joffrey has been traveling incognito again, stirring mischief. Trust only those men who have proven their loyalty to us. Jon shared this with Barristan, who read it and pursed his lips. The king is wise not to rush. Tywin rarely shows his hand unless he has something to gain. This grand tourney at Lannisport is no idle fancy. A cunning move, drawing knights and lords from across the west and beyond. He'll measure them, weigh them, and see which might be turned against us. Jon rubbed his temples. How long before Tywin tests the realm openly? Hard to say, Barristan replied. He wants to avoid a war unless he's sure he can win. For now, he'll gather power behind the scenes. The king's survival changed many calculations. But we cannot relax, for the Lannisters have long memories. So they remained in Highgarden, forging new ties each day. Jon sparred with Loras Tyrell in the courtyard, discovering that the Knight of Flowers was indeed as skilled as the songs claimed. Yet Loras was gracious in victory or defeat, praising Jon's footwork. Margaery continued her gentle flirtations, always with a poised courtesy that made it difficult for Jon to dismiss her. Renly teased Jon that he might do far worse than accept a Tyrell bride. All the while, the greater dance of alliances swirled around them, subtle and unseen. Amid the glittering southern realm, word drifted in from across the narrow sea, rumors that Daenerys Targaryen had become a widow queen, that she commanded 3 dragons hatched from petrified eggs. Many dismissed it as nonsense. Dragons had been extinct for more than a century. But others, particularly those who remembered the last gasps of House Targaryen, wondered if the impossible might be happening. Barristan heard these rumors with an unreadable expression, keeping his counsel. Jon tried to push them from his mind, focusing on the immediate. But a part of him could not help but wonder what it might mean for him if another Targaryen, one who claimed the Iron Throne by blood, returned. One afternoon, as he strolled the gardens with Margaery, she pointed out a patch of rare golden roses that only bloomed in the early summer. They're said to have been cultivated by Garth Greenhand's descendants, she explained, touching a delicate petal. We hold them dear, for they symbolize the beauty and bounty of the Reach. Jon found himself smiling despite his caution. I never learned much about flowers in the north. We have a short summer and only the hardiest blooms survive. She regarded him kindly. Hardy but no less beautiful in their own way, I'm certain. He hesitated, not sure why he felt compelled to speak honestly, but something in Margaery's manner invited it. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed by all this. The courtly life, the alliances, the deals. In Winterfell, I was a bastard. I expected no lands, no marriage, just a place to belong. Now everything is turned upside down. She studied him, her brown eyes steady. And do you feel that you've found your place? Or does the throne stand at an unreachable distance, no matter how close you draw? The question disarmed him by its directness. I'm not sure. My uncle, Lord Stark, always taught me that duty comes before desire. If my duty is to be heir, I will shoulder it. But I'm not certain if it's truly where I belong. Margaery reached out and gently plucked a single rose, carefully avoiding the thorns, then extended it to him. Perhaps none of us truly belong where fate places us. But we make our home there, or we let fate scatter us like petals in the wind. If you must wear a crown one day, it needn't be a prison. He took the rose, its soft petals brushing his fingers. He was aware of her closeness, of her quiet strength. Wise words, my lady. She smiled, and for a moment, the tension around them eased. He slipped the rose into his belt, feeling oddly comforted. That night, however, comfort gave way to new worries. A raven arrived late, bearing news from King's Landing that an outbreak of fever had spread through parts of Flea Bottom. Many were ill, some had died. The City Watch struggled to contain panic. King Robert was dispatching additional healers from the Reach, so Mace Tyrell swiftly offered to send skilled healers from his domain, eager to demonstrate generosity. Jon was reminded again that no matter how lovely the feasts, the realm was an ever-shifting tapestry of crises and alliances. He resolved to shorten his stay, eager to return to King's Landing and see for himself how matters stood. Margaery seemed disappointed at his impending departure, though she hid it with courtesy, promising to pray for those afflicted in the capital. On the morning he planned to leave, with the retinue forming in the courtyard, Jon found himself approached one last time by Mace Tyrell. The Lord's broad face held a convivial smile, but his tone was serious. My boy, it has been our delight to host you. I trust you have enjoyed the hospitality of Highgarden. Indeed, my lord, and I am grateful, Jon replied. Mace clapped him on the shoulder. I shall not press you for answers, but I hope you will speak favorably of my dear daughter to King Robert and Lord Stark. A strong union between our houses could ensure the realm's peace for generations." Jon gave a small bow. "I will convey your sentiments, Lord Tyrell." With that, they parted on good terms. Jon and his escort rode from Highgarden, heading back north and east toward King's Landing. The journey felt different now, the road more familiar, yet his mind was a tangle of conflicting hopes and worries. The possibility of a Tyrell alliance, the threat of Tywin Lannister's behind-the-scenes maneuvering, the presence of Joffrey's hidden scheming, and the ever-present lettered warnings from the wall about the others. As the retinue made camp one evening near a broad river crossing, Ser Barristan approached Jon, who was brushing down his horse. The old knight cleared his throat. "My lord, if I may ask, have you considered how you will present these new developments to the king?" Jon smoothed a hand along the horse's flank. "Yes. I'll tell him that the Tyrells are amenable to an alliance and that Marjorie might be a match worth contemplating. But I'll also remind him that I do not wish to be bound into anything without more thought." Barristan inclined his head. "That is wise. King Robert might welcome the news. Tywin Lannister will be less pleased to hear of it if it reaches his ears." Jon let out a short laugh. "Less pleased? He might try to buy the Tyrells off if he can. Or find some other Maya. NS to undermine us." A pause ensued before Barristan said quietly, "Be careful when you return to King's Landing, my lord. I have an ill feeling that the city's fever outbreak is not the only danger stirring." They pressed on and reached King's Landing near dusk on a humid summer's day. Even from a distance, Jon could sense the city's tension. There were fewer people thronging outside the gates. The guards who inspected them looked worn and sweaty, as though pressed into overtime. After passing through the gatehouse, they rode the winding streets and observed the shuttered shops and guarded looks from passers-by. Once lively corners were quieter, overshadowed by the threat of disease. An undercurrent of anxiety infused the air. In the Red Keep, Robert's stewards greeted them with relief. King Robert was in the throne room, hearing petitions related to the fever outbreak. As Jon dismounted, he noticed the presence of new banners. Lord Tyrell's healers had indeed arrived, as had some from Old Town, the seat of the Faith. The Faith's representative was none other than the High Septon's envoys, signifying the seriousness of the crisis. Jon and Barristan hurried to the throne room, where they found a weary-eyed Robert upon the Iron Throne, listening to the pleas of a group of merchants. The king's hair looked disheveled and sweat beaded on his brow in the torchlit hall. Yet he seemed determined, leaning forward as the merchants complained that the city watch was preventing them from leaving with their goods for fear of spreading the fever to the countryside. Robert's thunderous voice echoed, "If we let you flee with half the city's supplies, we'll have no food for those who remain. You'd leave the small folk to starve? No. You'll ration fairly, or you'll have me to answer to." The merchants quailed. One tried to protest, but Robert roared him down, the old fierce temper flaring. As that man slunk away, Robert spied Jon at the edge of the crowd. A flash of recognition lit the king's face, and he waved him forward. "About time you returned," he said, though the spark in his eyes showed some measure of relief. "Come, tell me what you've accomplished in the Stormlands and the Reach. You can speak privately with me and the small council. I've had enough of these whining traitors for the day." He dismissed the court, leaving only a handful of watchers, including Ser Barristan and a scowling Cersei near the throne's base. Jon stepped forward, noticing how Cersei's gaze flicked over him with open dislike. She wore a finely embroidered gown of deep green, her golden hair pinned back, but her lips were pressed thin, and a hint of shadows lingered under her eyes. She had not escaped the city's tension unscathed. Jon inclined his head. "Your Grace, I bring news of good tidings. The lords of the Stormlands welcome your continued rule. Lord Renly sends his regards. As for the Reach, Mace Tyrell was most hospitable. He suggests a possible match with his daughter Marjorie." Robert arched an eyebrow, leaning back against the throne's metal spines. "Does he now? I expected nothing less from that pompous windbag. Still, a union with the Tyrells is no small prize." Cersei's mouth curled in distaste. "Another flower for the crown? And you would put this pup in command of such alliances?" Robert's glare snapped toward her. "Be silent, woman, unless you have something constructive to say." She held his stare for a moment, defiance flickering, then looked away, knuckles taut around the arm of her seat. Robert returned his attention to Jon. "What say you? Think the girl suits you?" Jon measured his words carefully, mindful of Cersei's presence. "She is gracious, intelligent. I believe she would make a strong queen should that path be chosen. But I made no promises as you instructed." Robert nodded, tapping the armrest of the throne. "Good. We'll deliberate it. In truth, I might be inclined to seal that alliance quickly if Tywin shows signs of meddling further." But first, we must deal with this fever. He rose, letting out a weary sigh and gesturing for Jon to walk with him. Cersei stiffened, clearly not invited to join. Ser Barristan and a few guards fell in behind them as they exited the throne room, leaving the queen to simmer on her own. Robert led Jon up a winding set of stairs to a smaller council chamber, quieter. Once inside, Robert sank onto a wooden chair, not the imposing seat of the throne, and rubbed his temples. "A pox on all these crises," he muttered. "A fever in Flea Bottom, Goldcloaks overworked, Tywin hosting tournaments, your Lannister mother," he halted, correcting himself. "I mean, the damned Lannister brood's still scheming. And now talk of dragons across the sea. I don't know how many more burdens the realm can bear." Jon pulled a seat closer. "Is the fever truly so bad? It kills a few, but not all. Mostly the young and the elderly so far. Yet the smell of sickness puts fear into everyone's hearts. Men are refusing to handle corpses, so some bodies lay in the streets until the watch retrieves them. Maesters suspect it'll pass if we can keep the city clean and well-fed, but with trade slowing, coin is tight. Old Town's healers and the Tyrell men do help, I'll give them that, but it's slow going." Jon exhaled. The realm's fragility weighed on him anew. "What can I do to help, your grace?" Robert eyed him, a flicker of appreciation crossing his face. "The small folk like to see you as the wolf prince who cares. If you can, show your face in the city. Hand out bread, comfort the sick, or something of that sort. Remind them the throne doesn't abandon them. Gods know I can't be everywhere at once, and the people might trust you more. I'm not exactly known for soft measures." Jon nodded. "I'll do it. And about the Tyrell matcha?" Robert held up a hand. "Later. First we quell this fever. Then I'll speak with Nede. He's returning south soon, I commanded it. The Lannisters grow bolder, and I want my old friend by my side. We can weigh your marriage then." He paused, a distant regret flickering in his eyes. "I want to ensure you don't end up in a loveless union, as I did. I owe Lyanna that much." Something tightened in Jon's chest at Lyanna's name, but he only said softly, "Thank you, your grace." So the next chapter of Jon's life in King's Landing began. He spent the following days personally aiding the city watch as they distributed rations to the poorer districts. He went alongside the Tyrell healers to a makeshift infirmary set up in an old courtyard near Flea Bottom, offering words of encouragement to the sick. It was difficult, disheartening work. The stench of illness hung in the sweltering air, and the city seemed on the verge of panic. Yet in that gloom, Jon's presence did spark a faint hope. He was no miracle worker, but he refused to shy from the suffering. Men and women would sometimes bow awkwardly and call him my prince, while others, more jaded, scoffed. But he pressed on, distributing bread, water, and a handful of herbs carried by the Tyrell healers. Gradually, he saw the hearts of some small folk soften toward him. He was not Robert, not the roisterous king whose battles were half legendary, half monstrous, but a young man who had once been an outcast himself. He returned each night exhausted, haunted by the faces of the fever-stricken. Ser Barristan accompanied him often, ensuring his safety, while Tyrion Lannister sometimes flitted around the edges, observing with curiosity. On one evening, Tyrion approached him in the Red Keep's yard, sipping from a cup of wine. "You do realize half the city bards are already making up songs about the heroic wolf prince who ministers to the sick?" Jon brushed dust from his cloak, tired. "I'm no hero. Just doing what I can." Tyrion smirked. "Perception is everything, dear boy. If the small folk see you as a savior, the lords are more likely to bend the knee without complaint." He paused, swirling his wine. "Have a care, though. Some might see this as you trying to outshine the king. Cersei, for one, is spitting nails." Jon's brow nodded. "I don't wish to overshadow King Robert. I only want to help." Tyrion's eyes glinted. "Intentions matter little from what I've seen. Nonetheless, I find it refreshing. Keep it at Wolf Prince. You might just keep this realm from devouring itself, at least for a while longer." That night, Jon lay in bed, thinking of Tyrion's words. The role of a leader was as much shaped by others' perceptions as by one's own actions. He had not sought a crown, but it was pressing on him nonetheless in 1,000 subtle ways. In the weeks that followed, the fever began to subside thanks to cooler weather and the efforts of the healers. The city breathed a tentative sigh of relief. King Robert, having forced the merchants to share resources, found himself grudgingly lauded by some in Flea Bottom. Meanwhile, word arrived that Tywin Lannister's grand tourney in Lannisport had concluded with no overt show of rebellion. But whispers indicated he'd spent lavishly on feasting and prizes, forging new bonds with minor houses eager for Lannister gold. Amid the diminishing crisis, Ned Stark returned to the capital with a small retinue of northern men. His presence invigorated Jon, who needed his uncle's counsel more than ever. The day Ned arrived, Jon hurried to meet him in the courtyard, ignoring the ceremonial greetings to embrace him. Ned smiled, that rare, faint smile creasing his reserved features. "You look well, Jon," he said. "I've heard of your deeds in the city. I'm proud of you." Jon felt a flicker of warmth. "I missed you, Uncle. The king wants us to speak about the Tyrell alliance, and about other matters." Ned's smile faded. "I suspected as much. Let us see if we can navigate this without rousing the Lannisters' wrath." They climbed to the solar where Robert awaited them, wine already at hand. After pleasantries, Robert cut to the chase. "Stark, we need to settle the question of Jon's marriage. Tywin is building alliances. The Tyrells might be the surest way to counterbalance him. I'm strongly considering a betrothal to Margaery Tyrell." Ned folded his arms, considering. "I've not met the girl, but I trust your judgment if you say she's of good character." He glanced at Jon. "Would you accept such a match?" Jon felt a knot in his stomach but chose honesty. "She is admirable, my lord. I don't object, though I'd rather not rush. I feel I should know her better." Robert gave a mirthless chuckle. "You speak like a lovesick lad, wanting to woo your bride in the moonlight. You'll find such luxuries are sparse for those of our station. Still, you're right. I do not intend to shackle you to a girl you barely know if we can help it. But the realm's needs come first, do they not?" Jon stiffened. "Yes, your grace, they do." "Then we'll formalize a courtship," Robert decided, refilling his cup. "Not a binding betrothal yet, but a public arrangement that you're courting the Rose of Highgarden, so to speak. That should be enough to keep Tywin from forging a Tyrell alliance behind our backs. Meanwhile, if you find reasons to object, we can always break it off, though that might cause friction." Ned nodded slowly. "It's a sensible course. Let it be known you two are in negotiations for marriage. That, at least, will stay Tywin's hand." Jon couldn't deny a ripple of relief. It was not final. He would have more time to understand Margaery and ensure the union was not a loveless cage. Ned's gaze, resting on him, conveyed unspoken sympathy. Perhaps Ned recalled how Catelyn Tully had once been promised to Brandon Stark, then had to wed Ned after Brandon's death, an arrangement that, by some grace, had become a loving match in time. Jon dared hope he might find a similar fortune. Thus it was that Jon's status became entangled with Highgarden in a new, public way. Over the next few weeks, as the fever fully receded and the city's markets reopened, the king's court announced an official courtship between Jon, the king's nephew and heir, and Margaery Tyrell, the Rose of Highgarden. The new talk among the small folk revolved around the possibility of a grand wedding to rival any in living memory. Lords weighed the potential shift in power, House Stark, House Baratheon, and House Tyrell forming an unbreakable triumvirate. And if Targaryen blood ran in Jon's veins, well, that was not mentioned in official proclamations, but it lent a certain mystique. Cersei's fury was palpable. She rarely left her chambers except to cast venomous glares in the throne room. Joffrey, from his holdfast, sent coded letters that dripped with scorn, mocking the notion of a bastard wearing a crown. But Robert, reinvigorated by the city's recovery and the prospect of outmaneuvering Tywin, grew more confident again. He even took to sparring with his warhammer in the yard, occasionally letting Jon see that the mighty warrior still lurked beneath his aging frame. In moments alone with Ned, Robert confided his deeper fears that Tywin might still find a pretext for war, that the business with Cersei and Jaime's incest could erupt if any new scandal broke. Ned advised him to keep the realm unified and quell further rumors, so Robert continued to maintain the official line that Joffrey was simply unsuited to the throne, while never naming him a bastard in public. Yet the truth was known to many. It was the realm's open secret. And outside the capital, the world churned on. Ravens from the wall still spoke of wildling movements. The rumor of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons grew more persistent. The free cities across the narrow sea were abuzz with talk of a silver-haired queen forging alliances, though the details remained murky. Jon tried not to dwell on that too much, focusing on the tasks at hand. One night, deep in the Red Keep's library, he pored over old scrolls about the Targaryen dynasty, searching for some reference to rightful succession. He had never wanted the Targaryen claim, but he felt compelled to know its shape, its weight. He discovered countless tales of madness and cruelty, but also of wisdom and justice. Some Targaryen kings had been revered as noble, others reviled as tyrants. Rhaegar, the scrolls said, had been a bright star that burned too fast, undone by the tragedy of war. Jon fell asleep at the table, an old tome still open, only to jolt awake at dawn's light. His mind was a haze of roiling thoughts, about the future of the realm, about Marjorie Tyrell, about an exiled princess with dragons, about the others lurking beyond the wall. Through his tiredness, he felt a quiet resolve. He might never be truly certain if he was meant to sit the Iron Throne, but he would do all in his power to serve the kingdom well, as honor demanded. If that meant forging alliances, if that meant wearing a crown he had once scorned, so be it. He closed the tome and rose, pressing stiff muscles. The morning sun filtered through a narrow window, illuminating dust motes swirling in the still air. He thought of Lyanna Stark, the mother he never knew, and wondered if she could see him now. Would she be proud? Would she weep for what might have been, had the realm known peace from the start? Outside, the city was stirring, cocks crowing, merchants opening their stalls. Another day of forging alliances, fending off the Lannisters' machinations, and preparing for the storms that might yet break upon the realm. Jon squared his shoulders. He might be the Wolf Prince, or the Prince of Secrets, or something else entirely, but he would face whatever came with the northern steel he had learned in Winterfell and the sense of destiny thrust upon him by Robert's choice. As he stepped out into the corridor, the clang of steel from the training yard reached his ears. Perhaps he would join those knights in practice soon, but first he had a meeting with Ned and the king, and then a letter to dispatch to Highgarden. The game continued, and Jon Stark, Targaryen, or Baratheon, or all three, walked on, determined to shape a better future for the Seven Kingdoms, even under the looming shadows of war and winter. For the moment, at least, the realm had a fragile peace, anchored by one man's surprising survival and the quiet resolve of a boy who had once belonged nowhere and now found himself at the heart of everything. If the gods were good, that resolve would be enough to shield them all from the greater terrors yet to come. But in Westeros, the gods seldom granted easy paths. Even so, Jon would not yield. He would try to prove worthy of his mother's name, of Ned Stark's loyalty, and of King Robert's risky faith in him. And in that determination, against all odds, lay a seed of hope for the realm, a realm that had narrowly avoided tearing itself apart in a savage war, all because one boar's tusk had not quite managed to kill Robert Baratheon on that fateful day. Perhaps that alone was enough to tip the balance of history to let Westeros stand united when the real winter arrived. And if, in the stillness of his chambers each night, Jon sometimes dreamed of White Walkers gliding through haunted forests or dragons dancing in the sky, he reminded himself that not all dreams were prophecies and not all fears came to pass. But a wise king or a wise heir would be ready all the same.